All right, hello everyone. So here is our final chapter for this week's reading, talking about one of the most cool parts of world history slash one of the most significant events in human history, the Columbian Exchange, which would be the movement of peoples, goods, and ideas across the Atlantic Ocean. American things to Eurasia and Africa, and Eurasian African things over into America. Um, so here's our vocab. I will also kind of scoot my head up to let you see that. Here, there we go. And then we'll go to, I think we have a second page. We do. And I'll move myself in the corner again. All right. So let's get started. Oh my God, my hair today. It's very middle part today. Okay. So, all right. So, the first subtopic we're going to look at is disease and population catastrophe. And so, one of the most significant events on the American side, which then enables Europe to really take advantage of its of the resources of America, is the introduction of diseases, specifically animal-borne illnesses, um, into the Americas. I'm going to refer to as America as like the supercontinent for this chapter. It's easier for my brain. Okay, so there's two factors that play a role in why Americans were more susceptible to diseases from Eurasia. The first would be the historic isolation of Americans from Eurasian illnesses. So this would make it the consequence of contact non-unique to European contact. So, say for example, East Asians ended up in America first, and these diseases would impact Americans just the same. Okay, because remember, Americans came to America over the Bering Strait before animal domestication occurred to a great extent, specifically before the domestication of like ungulates like sheep or bovines like cows and horses as well. They're not either of those things, but like the domestication of like mammals like that. Dogs were domesticated, but that was like the extent to it, okay? And what's so important about that, and I talked about in my class when we first started talking about civilization, is that actually proximity to animals exposes humans to a lot more diseases like smallpox, chickenpox, cowpox, all the poxes. Think about the fleas and the rats spreading bubonic plague. That animals carry these diseases that are so damaging to people, right? And so Americans that did not have those immunities that had been cultivated in the Afro-Eurasian population for the past 10,000 years. And so, when Europeans arrive in the Americas, these diseases have an extensive destabilizing impact on the polities of the Americas, on the populations of the Americas to a significant extent. So, two great examples of how impactful these diseases were on the conquest of the Americas would be looking at the consequences of the Spanish conquistadors in Meso and South America. So in South America, there's actually some distinctive circumstantial impacts. This happens closer to the middle of the 16th century in the 1540s-ish, when Francisco Pizarro makes contact with the Inca, this massive state that we've talked about in Unit 1 and 2. But also Pizarro benefits from the fact that the Inca engaged in an extensive, brutal civil war that is caused in part by the plague, the introduction of Eurasian diseases as they spread from Mesoamerica and the South American coast into the Andean region. So actually, the Eurasian diseases arrive before the Europeans get there. And as a consequence of that instability, the Inca, which are this massive state, are poorly equipped to resist the Inca and the Spanish incursion into Inca territory. The same thing happens with the Mexico or the Aztecs in Mesoamerica. Cortez is there in the 1520s. The Spanish, it's only a force of 500 Europeans. that eventually conquer the Aztecs. What's remarkable is that it's not actually 500 soldiers. The Spanish are able to leverage a Mesoamerican discontent with Aztec rule against the Aztecs. And so it's 500 Europeans and several thousand, maybe over 10,000 Americans that work with the Spanish to defeat the Aztecs. And there's a fateful moment that eventually the Spanish and their American allies surround Tenochtitlan, this massive lake city that's the capital of the Aztec Empire, after the Aztec have been exposed to these Eurasian illnesses, and Tenochtitlan is completely destroyed demographically by this diseases before the Europeans even come back into it. They go in there first, and it's kind of catastrophe for the Europeans initially. Smallpox is the most important disease, but diseases like malaria, influenza, and measles also play a significant impact on the population of the Americas. It's always hard when I do these videos during 8th period because my body's so tired from the whole teaching day. And depending on what you look at, I think the most egregious estimates are about 90% of the population in certain regions were destroyed by these diseases. But in many places, like in Mesoamerica, 50% of the population was killed by disease. But like in places like in like the Northern America, especially in the East Coast, Native American populations are more affected by diseases. Also parts of like the East Coast of South America as well. So the next consequence of the Columbian Exchange is, I'm going to pause it. I'm going to pause talking so you can like kind of pause me here and start taking notes. And then I'm going to move down. I can maybe down to the bottom left corner. No, that's awful. That's worse. Where do I go? Okay. I guess it's a better place to go. So, another significant element beyond diseases, another environmental exchange, is the movement of foods and animals. So American diets were pretty limited in terms of meat. Like any meat that could be acquired by hunting was utilized, and that was like the kind of when meat was the diet that was there. The American diets changed to the introduction of Eurasian meats and grain, like things like actual like wheat and things like that. Change American diets. Yeah. Like actually, a really fascinating thing to think about was Europeans used to rationalize the prevalence of human sacrifice in American belief systems in Meso and South America through like the lack of protein in American diets before the introduction of like mammals from Eurasia. That's why sometimes human sacrifice involved the consuming of people and cannibalism. That like is like such a ethnocentric way of thinking of it, because Americans had access to beans, which are a far more sustainable source of protein than like human meat in the end. But also I want you guys to like now to move off from that. I want you guys to conceptualize like cooking, like Mexican cooking, how important ingredients like pork and beef and cheese are, which all are from Eurasian sources like cows and pigs and cows again. But also ancestral ingredients like corn and tomatoes are these American ingredients that are a fusion, right? These are Mexican cooking is an example of the Columbian Exchange that persists into the present period, right? The key grain in Mesoamerican cuisine and consumption was maize, or what we call corn, right? And cacao, not as significant as prevalent as corn might be, but still an important part of the American diet. And something that AMSCO does that I really take umbrage with is not focusing on the potato that was domesticated and cultivated in the Andes region. Specifically because the potato, more than any crop found in America and brought into Eurasia, specifically Europe, is as important. Specifically for Europeans, because the potato can survive in the more northern climates of Europe, that gives European populations access to this high calorie food and is responsible for a significant growth in the population, because the potato is almost ideal for cultivation in Europe. And not just Ireland, but actually the European diet is transformed by the introduction of the tomato. Tomato less so. except Italians. Sorry to stereotype. And then beyond consumption, animals like cows and mostly cows are, and other bovines used in like cultivation to pull plows and things like that, like oxen. Those are important, but probably the most significant work animal that's not consumed as frequently is the horse. Because so the horse is introduced to Americans and specifically to the nomadic populations in what we call like the Midwest of the United States today, completely transforms the culture and politics of these states. So typically nomadic groups, they like the groups like the Cree, the Sioux, the Comanche were nomadic groups that moved around the Great Plains region, consuming things like the American bison. The what do you call it? I gotta move in a second because my laptop's supposed to die. They still interacted with the bison and hunted it, but the horse completely changes how how they hunt the bison and are far more productive and they kind of explode in the American Midwest. The Comanche conquer a vast amount of territory as a consequence of the exposure to the horse. In a lot of ways, they take on the attributes of pastoral nomads in the region, in Eurasia during this period. I gotta pause it to find my charger. Okay, sorry. So now we're going to move to the next slide. Okay, so the next element of the Columbian Exchange would be the impact of the climate giving Europeans access to the cultivation of crops that were far more lucrative than crops historically had been cultivated in America, in Europe, right? So this involves the introduction of coerced labor through chattel slavery, which chattel slavery will be explicitly defined in a succeeding chapter. But what we want to know is that like the driving factor of the movement of enslaved Africans to America and the Caribbean was the value of the cash crops being cultivated. Okay, and that when Africans were brought across, AMSCO really wants to make note of the bringing over things like okra and rice. There is, I would call it, I think it's more than a myth, but harder to historically verify that enslaved Africans brought over seeds of crops indigenous to Africa, like okra and also rice, which is indigenous beyond Africa, but that part of what Africans brought with them were what they consumed, and they would hide them actually in their hair. Like that was like that's a part of like some legend about the experience of enslaved Africans and things like that. So, specifically the Caribbean and the eastern coast, specifically like the Middle Eastern coast of South America, were ideal for the cultivation of sugarcane. When Europeans first determined that, because the Spanish had sugarcane cultivation on the African coast, and the climate was kind of the same. They used the indigenous Americans, like the Carib people in like modern day Cuba and things like that, to cultivate sugar. However, demographic impacts like disease, reduced population, the harshness of the labor led to likely escape from the coercive labor system, and also Americans were equipped to hide from Europeans far more effectively. And so, in general, Americans were not the ideal population to use for a coercive labor system. Okay. In general, what makes the cultivation of sugar so difficult is that you need to have like a lot of heavy pressure and heavy machinery, and you're running a constant fire at a very high heat to extract and refine like cane juice into actual crystallized sugar. And so, people who worked sugarcane cultivation, it was highly dangerous. It would be not uncommon for someone to be maimed or injured as a consequence of working in sugarcane cultivation, or worked in to such a point of exhaustion to die of exhaustion. Okay, so this was actually highly dangerous and damaging work that Africans were brought into doing. Um, and we talked about also in the preceding chapter was that these European states are all observing each other and then also building on the successes of each other, copying each other, and reiterating. Right, they're making their own production more effective through the observation of what their rivals are doing elsewhere. Right, so because the Portuguese, though they're initially the sugarcane cultivators, France, Britain, and Spain all observe value in that, and so, for example, each of those states, France gets Saint Domingue on the island of Hispaniola. Um, uh, Spain uses Cuba for sugarcane cultivation, and Britain uses Jamaica for sugar cultivation as well. So they all develop a colony that develops the same kind of like value to it. As a cash crop, it is probably the most valuable crop. It completely changes the Eurasian diet too, because sugar used to be a pretty rare commodity, but also a high demand commodity because of the flavor that it imparts to food. It's even though we think of sugar and sweetness as such a common taste, and specifically the American diet, it was pretty rare. I joke about in my classes that like Europeans, like your sweetness for Europeans was like honey, apples, beet sugar. Like that is what sweetness was in your context before sugar became affordable through the use of slave labor. But now think about how often added sugars are part of our diet. And that is introduced with the availability of sugar. Now current corn syrup is a far more prevalent sweetness additive in food. But that demand for sugar is first brought out through the introduction of sugar in this cultivation during the period. But also, sugar is a Eurasian crop that is brought to America to be cultivated. It is cultivated far more extensively in America than it was ever cultivated in Eurasia. It also is what brings Africans into Eurasia as well, from Eurasia or specifically Africa to the Americas as well. Like their Africans don't come with to the scale that they do without slavery. And then I guess I didn't say, in the end, 90% of enslaved people go to the Caribbean, and the vast quantity go to Brazil, actually, in the end. That's something I didn't talk about in there. Okay, I believe this is our final slide. Yes, our final slide is talking about the consequence of Africans being brought to America. And it's hard to say this is one of these historiographical blind spots because these people were disconnected and in many ways disinherited of the agency to share their experience. And so a lot of this experience exists between the lines. And we have to kind of read between the lines of the African experience when understanding what they brought, what happened to them, okay? The broader term we can use is the African diaspora. There is diaspora occurring before this in the Indian Ocean trade, right? There, East Africans are both being moved as slaves into the Arab world, into India, into even China, in Japan. There's a very famous black samurai, actually in Japanese history. I can't remember his name right now, but he is one of the main characters in the newer Assassin's Creed game being released in 2025, because this video might be around for a while. But this diaspora is really the movement of West Africans and Central Africans into the Americas, okay? One of the most important things that happens is the linguistic developments that occur. Because the motive of enslavement was practical profit motive, there was no attention invested in in keeping Africans of a similar culture and language together. In fact, it might have been to a slave owner's benefit to separate Africans of similar languages and cultures from each other to keep them from becoming united. Okay, so in that case, African language is no longer intelligible among the Africans that are working together. But still, meaning and communication has to occur. And so what happens is the development of what are called Creole languages, where broad African languages. Like these are all languages often of a single language family, Bantu speaking specifically, but even then, and Arabic as well, which is not a Bantu language, those two predominant linguistic families blend with the languages of the enslavers, be that Spanish, French, and English. Those are and Portuguese. Are the predominant languages. So Creole is a fusion of this enslaver and colonizer's language with the African languages that these people had. And so, like, they'll have Bantu languages, they'll have Arabic as well as a part of these Creole, as well as like Spanish, English, French, or Portuguese. And because like things like literacy were not encouraged, but also not even broadly available yet, we are missing that like experience beyond like an oral history. I know that I will probably talk about in a book talk about kind of like a very rare story about like how someone in the 1970s was able to find the village that their ancestor was kidnapped from in the 1600s through like rare historical methods, but I don't want to talk about it right now because I'm at 20 minutes of the video. Musically, because music doesn't need material to exist, culturally it continued. Specifically, like African rhythms and percussion became a central part to many a cultural music families in the Americas. So music genres like gospel, jazz, blues, hip hop, samba, and reggae all are influenced by African rhythms and percussion practices from West Africa or Central Africa itself. In a lot of ways, it becomes like a unique expression of African American culture, not just like when I say African American, I'm not just talking about like African Americans in the United States, but Africans in America and Caribbean and South America as well. Like a good example of this would be like the African American spiritual. Often was obviously the interpretation of Christianity through a Black lens, but specifically songs like "Go Down Moses" connect the experience of the Hebrews in the Book of Exodus in the Christian tradition with and the attempt for manumission and liberation of Hebrews from Egypt with the desire for freedom of African Americans in the American South. Food as well, like that is why rice and okra is brought up earlier in the chapter. Like those are gumbo and rice are key ingredients in gumbo, which is a kind of stew that adds in a bunch of Eurasian ingredients like bell peppers and onions, rice. You put chicken in there. You could put shrimp, which is probably going to be indigenous to like the Gulf Coast region and things like that. I think another example would be like the Holy Trinity, which are the central aromatic components of all Cajun cooking. Which is, in part the experience of what enslaved Africans in Louisiana consumed, would be the use of bell peppers, which are an American ingredient with onions and, oh my gosh, what's the other one? Celery, which are Eurasian ingredients, okay? So that is our video on the Columbian Exchange, and I will see you guys in the next video, but probably, the next one will be a new one. See you guys.